They didn't keep Mussolini in a jail, they kept him on a mountain 2,000 metres up, where cliffs and thin air did the guarding for Italy. Hitler wanted him back, not as a man, but as a message. So the Germans didn't send an army up the road. They sent gliders out of the sky, silent, fast, and aimed at a landing zone that barely existed right beside the prison itself. In this video, you'll learn how terrain, timing and shock turned a secure fortress into a 10-minute collapse, and why that rescue didn't just save a dictator. It helped ignite the next, darker phase of the war in Italy. They didn't hide him in a jail, they hid him inside the weather, a stone hotel on a mountain shelf, cliffs on 3 sides, thin air, one cable car line as the only clean way up. If Italy could keep Mussolini there long enough, they could hand him to the Allies and bury the symbol before Germany could revive it. Hitler didn't want the man, he wanted the meaning. Because once Mussolini was paraded back into daylight, it wouldn't just be a rescue, it would be a message to every wavering ally and every occupied capital. Germany could still reach anywhere, even the sky. The problem was the mountain. Campo Imperatore sat high on the Gran Sasso plateau, isolated and exposed, like a shipwreck stranded above the clouds. Down below, the cable car station and the roads were choke points, easy to raid, easy to block, easy to sabotage. Up top, the hotel was a prison without bars, guarded by carabinieri who didn't need to build walls because the mountain already had. And yet, the mountain also had a weakness, not a crack in the rock, a crack in time. Italy had collapsed into confusion. Mussolini had been moved again and again, shuffled like contraband from one hiding place to another, because the new government feared exactly what Germany was planning. Every transfer created rumours, every rumour created a trail, and trails, if you have enough eyes, eventually lead somewhere. German intelligence finally pinned him to the Hotel Campo Imperatore. Now the raid wasn't a question of if, it was how. You can't storm a mountain hotel with a normal assault. Not fast enough, not clean enough. Not before the guards either execute the prisoner, or the prisoner disappears again, or the world hears about the attempt and the whole point, shock, evaporates. So the German planners designed a 2-part operation built around one idea: remove the guards' ability to decide. Down below, a ground force would seize the cable car base, cut communications and isolate the plateau. Up above, an airborne team would land directly beside the hotel, so close that hesitation would be fatal. There would be no warning shots, no drawn-out firefight, no time for the guards to organise. The raid had to be over before anyone could understand it was happening. That meant gliders, not parachutes, not noisy aircraft circling overhead. Gliders that could appear like silent knives, sliding out of the sky and touching down where no one expected anything to land. It was an insane concept for this terrain. The plateau was uneven, the landing space was tight, the air was thin, the margin for error was basically the width of a coffin. But that was the point. A bold plan doesn't just beat defences, it overloads the human brain. When something impossible happens, people freeze long enough for you to take control. On the morning of September 12th, the operation began to move. Below the mountain, armoured vehicles and paratroopers surged toward the cable car station. The first goal wasn't glory, it was silence. Cut the phone lines, stop any warning from rising to the hotel, turn the entire prison into an island with no radio, no outside voice, no time. At the same time, aircraft towing gliders lifted into the air. 10, more in reserve depending on the account. Each one packed with men, equipment, and the kind of tension that makes your hands feel too large for your own body. Inside those gliders there was no comfort, no engine vibration to reassure you that you're in control, just wind, wood, steel, and the knowledge that your landing zone is a mountain shelf. Some of these men were Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers trained for decisive violence, trained to take an objective fast, trained to keep moving even when the plan breaks. And above them all sat the real commander of the mission's logic, the timetable. If the gliders landed too early, the ground force might not have cut the lines yet. If they landed too late, the hotel guards might sense something wrong. If the gliders landed scattered, the assault would become a mess of small groups that could be pinned down and picked apart. There were only 2 outcomes that mattered. Either the hotel was taken in minutes, or it turned into a public disaster on top of a mountain. As the tow planes climbed, the plateau grew clearer in the distance, an unnatural flatness in a world of slopes. The hotel itself sat like a block of pale stone against the darker rock, too exposed, too easy to see, as if it was daring someone to try. That was the final insult of Campo Imperatore. The prison wasn't hidden, it was displayed. Which meant the rescue would be displayed too. As the gliders released, time slowed in a way only fear can create. Pilots fought for alignment. Men inside gripped straps and weapons. The ground rushed closer, rock, scrub, then the plateau itself, rushing upward like a wall. The first glider came in hard, and then another. Wooden skids slammed earth. Wings scraped. A landing that would have been called a crash anywhere else became a success simply because it didn't kill everyone on impact. And suddenly there were soldiers on the roof of Italy. The hotel guards had seconds to interpret what they were seeing. Not troops marching up the cable car road. Not a distant firefight down the mountain, but enemy soldiers landing right beside them, appearing out of thin air with the calm certainty of people who had already decided the outcome. This is where the operation's real weapon came into play: confusion. The Carabinieri weren't facing a slow assault. They were facing a finished reality. Men spilled from the gliders and sprinted toward the hotel entrance. Weapons raised, orders shouted. The geometry of the fight collapsed instantly because there was no line of approach to defend. The attackers were already inside the defended space, and inside that space the guards had one problem they couldn't solve with bullets. They weren't sure they were allowed to fire. The Germans had brought an Italian general with them, part intimidation, part theatrical shield, because the entire operation depended on the guards hesitating. If those Carabinieri opened up, the raid would become a firefight in a tourist hotel. Mussolini could be killed in crossfire. The propaganda victory could become a nightmare. So the assault hit the guards with too many pressure points at once. German weapons, Italian authority, surprise landing, the sudden sense that resistance would be pointless. The result wasn't a heroic last stand. It was a vacuum. A moment where the defenders didn't know what decision would keep them alive. And into that vacuum the raiders surged, and hallways, stairwells, doors kicked open. The hotel's clean geometry, built for ski tourists and quiet holidays, was instantly redefined into angles of threat. The building was still the same stone and glass, but the meaning of every corridor changed the moment soldiers entered it. They reached Mussolini fast, because speed was the only mercy this plan contained. For weeks he had been moved like a secret too dangerous to keep in one place. Now he stood at the window of a mountain hotel while history came to collect him again, and he understood what the rescue meant even before the men reached his door. This wasn't just about freeing him, it was about resurrecting him. Within minutes the prison was no longer a prison, it was a stage. German cameras were ready, photographs were taken. The moment was framed the way they needed it framed. The strong hand reaching into the impossible place, pulling the fallen ally back into the light. Outside, the plateau filled with activity. Guards disarmed, attackers securing the perimeter, men scanning the edges of the cliff as if expecting the mountain itself to strike back. And then came the most fragile part of the entire mission. Leaving. You can seize a building in minutes. You can shock guards into surrender. You can even make the impossible look routine. But extraction is where reality returns. A small aircraft was brought in, a short takeoff plane meant for rough landing conditions. The idea was to lift Mussolini off the plateau before anything could change, before Italians could organise, before the Allies could react, before the story could be interrupted. The aircraft's limits were strict. Weight mattered, air density mattered, run distance mattered. And on a plateau like this, the takeoff wasn't a takeoff. It was a gamble. Because if the plane failed to lift, it wouldn't just crash. It would tumble off a mountain. Mussolini was loaded in. The plane turned into the wind. The plateau fell away behind the wheels, and for a breath-long moment the aircraft didn't fly. It sank. Then it caught air, just enough. The machine clawed forward, skimming above rock and slope, climbing into open space like a man hauling himself out of drowning water. The rescue was complete, but the war story wasn't, because this operation didn't end on the mountain. It continued in newspapers, newsreels, and whispered credit. It became a propaganda weapon sharpened for morale and myth, sold as proof that Germany could still bend reality. And that mattered, because in 1943 Germany needed miracles more than it needed truth. By the time the world heard Mussolini had been taken from Campo Imperatore, the details were already being shaped. The raid would be retold with clean heroes and clean victories, even though the real victory had been something colder. A perfect strike against hesitation. A mission designed to exploit terrain, psychology and speed so completely that resistance never had a chance to become a fight. And the most dangerous part of the story wasn't the landing, it was what came after. Because once Mussolini was free, Italy wasn't just a country in chaos. It was a battlefield where loyalties could be resurrected, where symbols could be weaponized, where a single rescued man could be used to justify years more blood. They called it a rescue, but the mountain knew better. It was an extraction of a ghost, and ghosts don't come back quietly. What made the Gran Sasso raid terrifying wasn't the gunfire, it was how quickly the world could be rewritten. Mussolini had been arrested on 25th of July 1943, and the new Italian government spent the following weeks moving him like contraband. First to places that looked secure on paper, then to places that were secure only because they were isolated. Ponza, La Maddalena. And finally the highest, loneliest option, Hotel Campo Imperatore, perched over 2,100 metres up on the Gran Sasso Massif, a hotel shaped for tourists, turned into a cage by altitude. The logic was simple. If the Germans found him, they still couldn't reach him fast. That assumption is what the raid was built to kill, because the planners weren't thinking like a normal army. They weren't trying to win a firefight. They were trying to steal time, to arrive so suddenly that the guards never got a clean moment to choose resistance. The whole operation was designed around one brutal truth. In a surprise assault, hesitation is the softest armour on earth. And the Germans found the soft spot in the mountain security. The plateau was isolated, but the hotel wasn't magic. It still relied on the cable car station and communications down below. That's why the plan was split. One fist on the ground, one blade from the sky. Major Harald Mors handled the ground piece, seized the base, cut telephone lines, and make sure nothing on the plateau could call for help. If the plateau was an island, the cable car station was the dock, so Mors took the dock. The ground assault moved with a kind of quiet urgency that doesn't look dramatic on film but decides everything in real life. Vehicles rolling fast, men spreading into positions, a station captured before it could become a warning system. Phone lines cut so cleanly that the mountain above might as well have been on another planet. Now the hotel was blind, and that meant the gliders could become the whole story. The airborne element used DFS 230 gliders, towed in, then released for a silent approach to the plateau. The choice was calculated madness. Paratroopers might drift, aircraft might be heard, but gliders could slide in like a whisper until the moment they slammed into the ground. Up on the plateau, the guards didn't have the luxury of context. They didn't hear a front line advancing, and they didn't see a convoy climbing the mountain. They looked up and watched enemy soldiers land beside the hotel. That is not a normal human moment. It's the kind of moment where the brain checks for a trick, then checks again, and in those seconds you can lose a war. The attackers moved immediately, fast enough that the building's layout stopped being hotel and became objective. Hallways turned into corridors of control, doors became choke points, stairwells became accelerators. The raid's strength wasn't just surprise, it was that the assault group arrived already mentally inside the structure, already acting like the building belonged to them, and the guards, carabinieri posted to watch a prisoner not fight a battle, were hit with a pressure stack they couldn't resolve cleanly. German weapons, Italian authority figures used as leverage. The fear that firing would trigger an execution or a propaganda catastrophe. So instead of a firefight, there was that deadly pause, the gap between should we and can we. The raiders didn't need to win a battle, they needed to walk through that pause. Mussolini was found and brought out quickly. The details of the moment became instantly valuable, because the rescue wasn't intended to be private. It was intended to be seen. The Nazis marketed it as a stunning feat at a time when Germany badly needed a morale jolt. That's the part most people miss when they treat this like an action scene. This wasn't only a tactical raid, it was a narrative weapon. And the weapon still had to survive the most fragile part: extraction. The plateau gives you a problem that doesn't care about ideology: physics. Thin air reduces lift, rough ground reduces runway. A light aircraft can land, but taking off with extra weight is where you flirt with the edge of gravity. And the plan depended on an aircraft known for short takeoff and landing, the Fieseler of Arma 156 Storch. The Storch wasn't a heroic symbol, it was a tool, a fragile-looking machine summoned to do something unforgiving: lift a political prisoner off a mountaintop before anyone could interfere. Accounts of that moment often focus on Otto Skorzeny's presence and the dramatic image of Mussolini boarding the small plane. Some sources emphasize Skorzeny insisting on accompanying Mussolini, pushing the aircraft to its limits. But the deeper truth is colder than the myth. The rescue was planned and executed by Mors under Kurt's student, and then aggressively packaged into a story that favoured the SS image machine. That split between operational reality and propaganda credit is part of why this story sticks. Because it reveals how modern war doesn't just fight for ground, it fights for attention. The Storch lined up, the wheels rolled, and the aircraft had to become a bird in air that didn't want to hold it. This is the moment where the operation could have collapsed into humiliation. Not from gunfire, but from a failed takeoff. An aircraft bogged down on rough ground, sliding toward disaster while the world's perfect raid died in front of cameras. But it lifted, barely, by many retellings. Enough to escape the plateau and hand the mission to the next phase, moving Mussolini to German control before Italy could reverse the moment. And once Mussolini was free, the rescue wasn't the end, it was ignition. Because by late summer 1943, Italy was already splitting under pressure. Mussolini's fall wasn't just a leadership change, it was a sign the Axis alliance was cracking. The Germans needed a counterstory, strength, control, reach. Gran Sasso provided it. A mountaintop prison, a silent landing, a dictator pulled back into daylight. But the real strategic effect wasn't only that Mussolini was rescued, it was what the rescue allowed. A rescued Mussolini could be used to legitimize a new political structure under German influence. A symbol could be put back on the board. And symbols in collapsing states can be worth more than divisions. That's why the raid matters. Not because it was cool, not because it was daring, because it proves something that keeps showing up across modern conflict. If you can control the story fast enough, you can control what people think is possible. And once people think something is possible, once fear and momentum shift, whole countries begin to move. The Gran Sasso raid ended in minutes. Its consequences lasted much longer, because the mountain didn't just give Mussolini back, it gave the Reich a headline. And headlines are how wars stay alive when the battlefield stops cooperating. The rescue was over before most of Italy even understood Mussolini was gone. But the war didn't reward speed with peace. It rewarded speed with consequences. Within hours, Germany treated the operation like proof of life for an empire that was already wobbling. Photographs spread. Headlines hardened. The message was simple. The Reich could still reach anywhere, even through mountains, even through governments, even through betrayal. Italy heard a different message. If Germany could take Mussolini from the sky, Germany could take anything. And that's when the rescue stopped being a raid and became a warning. Because by September 1943, Italy wasn't a single country anymore. It was a fracture line. One part trying to step away from Germany, another part still wired into fascist loyalty, and between them, German troops moving with the cold certainty of an occupying power that had already decided how this would end. Mussolini's extraction didn't soothe that fracture, it widened it. The moment he crossed into German hands, he wasn't a leader returning. He was a piece being repositioned, a symbol carved out of captivity and dropped back onto the board so Berlin could claim legitimacy, while it tightened control. That was the strategic genius beneath the drama. The raid didn't need to win battles. It needed to make an alternative Italy possible, an Italy that could be used to justify the iron grip that followed. And followed it did. As German forces rushed to disarm Italian units, seize key cities and lock down railways and ports, the rescue began to look less like a daring special operation and more like the first frame of a larger takeover. Troops who had fought beside Germans suddenly found themselves surrounded, ordered, stripped of autonomy, and in many cases treated like enemies. Italy had switched sides on paper, but on the ground, papers burn, and the rescue had lit the match. Meanwhile, Mussolini, the man who had once stood on balconies and commanded crowds, moved through Germany like a transported artifact, protected, escorted, displayed. He was alive, but the power around him wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the machinery that had chosen to rebuild him. That's the ugliness of rescues and collapsing alliances. They don't restore independence, they restore usefulness. Soon, Mussolini would reappear as the head of a new regime in northern Italy, a state shaped by German needs more than Italian will. The world would be told he had returned. But what returned was not the same man who had once ruled. A rescued dictator doesn't come back stronger, he comes back owned. And deep down, everyone involved knew it. Because the Gran Sasso raid wasn't just about breaking into a prison, It was about proving that no prison mattered if Germany decided it didn't. It was about turning geography into theatre and theatre into obedience. That's why the operation became myth so quickly. Myth travels faster than nuance. Myth doesn't ask whether the guards hesitated. Myth doesn't ask whether the plan depended on an Italian general as a human pressure point. Myth doesn't ask whose hands actually built the timetable. Myth just says they did the impossible. And in war, impossible is currency. But the most dangerous part of the story is what the myth hid. Because the raid was clean on the plateau only because the enemy didn't resist. That wasn't guaranteed. It was engineered. The planners were gambling that shock would replace bullets. If even one guard had decided to fire early, the hallway fight would have turned the hotel into a killing box. If Mussolini had been hit, the entire operation becomes a propaganda corpse. If the Storch had failed to lift, the rescue becomes a public crash at the edge of a mountain. Everything depended on a string of fragile decisions made by strangers under pressure. That's what special operations really are. Not superhero moments. They are chains, and chains snap, which is why the operation's aftermath mattered so much. Germany couldn't let the world see fragility. Germany needed certainty. So it wrapped the raid in a story that looked inevitable, decisive, and controlled. That story boosted morale. It intimidated opponents. It forced people to look up at the mountain and think, if they can do that, what else can they do? And while the world stared at the stunt, the machinery moved elsewhere, into rail yards, into ports, into ministries, into the heart of a collapsing ally. A rescue becomes cover. Cover becomes occupation. Occupation becomes the real war. On the Gran Sasso plateau, the hotel returned to being a hotel. The wind returned to being wind. The cliffs returned to being cliffs. But the country below did not return to anything. Because after Gran Sasso, Italy didn't just have a civil fracture. It had a target painted on it by its former ally. And Mussolini, alive, photographed and displayed, became the excuse. The raid was finished. The consequences were just getting warmed up. And the men who carried it out understood something most audiences never see. You can win a mission in 10 minutes, and still set fire to a continent for years. The mountain gave them their headline. Now Germany would collect its payment, and Italy would pay it in blood.